All right, let's jump right into a really important topic for your UPSC prep, the Indian Council Act of 1892. Now, I know what you might be thinking, just another act, another date to memorize, right? But trust me, this one is so much more than that. It's a fascinating story of pressure, of giving just a little bit and some really smart political moves. We're going to break down exactly what the British decided to give up, what they absolutely refused to let go of, and why this act is a super critical stepping stone that you've got to understand for both your prelims and your mains. Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we'll set the stage, get a feel for the political pressure cooker that was building up. Then we'll look at what the British kept firmly in their grip, the stuff they wouldn't change. After that, we'll dive into the nitty-gritty of the changes both centrally and in the provinces. And we'll wrap it all up by trying to answer that big question. Was this a real reform or just a clever way to buy more time? So, Section 1, setting the stage. To really get why the 1892 Act even happened, we've got to rewind a bit and look at the whole political scene. I mean, laws don't just appear out of nowhere, right? They're always a reaction to something, and this one is a perfect example. Okay, check out this timeline. For a long time, the 1861 Act was basically the rule book. But then, boom, 1885. The Indian National Congress is formed, and this was a total game changer. Think about it. Before the INC, you had lots of different demands all scattered around. But the INC brought it all together, creating this one powerful, unified voice for Indian nationalism. Suddenly, the British had a real political force they couldn't just brush aside. And the 1892 Act, well, that was their direct response to this new pressure. So, what exactly was the INC asking for? Well, it wasn't just small stuff. Their demands, as you can see, struck at the very heart of how the British ruled. They said, we want more Indians in the legislatures. They wanted actual elections, not just the Viceroy picking his favorites. And, this is a big one, they wanted to be able to discuss the budget and financial matters. These weren't just polite suggestions. This was the beginning of a real push for self-governance. So the ball was in Britain's court. How did they respond? All right, Section 2. And this is something that's super interesting and honestly just as important for your exams as the changes themselves. We're going to look at what the 1892 Act didn't change. Because what the British chose to hold on to, well, that tells you everything you need to know about their real strategy. And here it is, laid out plain and simple. This really gets to the core of their thinking. You see, they were okay with making a few tweaks to the legislative side of things, the talking shops. But the real engine room of power, the executive, that was completely walled off, untouchable. The ultimate control stayed with the Secretary of State back in London, and the Viceroy's Executive Council in India kept all its power. So the message was clear. Sure, you can talk a bit more, but rule? No way. We're still in charge. Okay, on to Section 3, the changes in the central legislature. Now, this is where things get really interesting. We start to see some of the biggest reforms in the Act, but they all come with some very, very clever limits attached. The details here are absolutely key. So here's the first thing they gave. The INC said, we want more people at the table, and the British said, okay. They increased the number of these non-official additional members from a range of 6 to 12 up to 10 to 16. So yeah, on the surface, it looks like a win. More Indians get to be in the room. But as we're about to find out, just being in the room doesn't mean you have any real power. Okay, pay close attention here. This is pure gold for your mains answers. Remember how the INC demanded elections? Well, the British came back with this complicated system of nomination. It wasn't the Viceroy just picking people anymore. Now, bodies like provincial assemblies and the Chamber of Commerce could recommend people. It was a really clever workaround, wasn't it? They created something that felt a little bit like an election without ever actually using the word election or giving up the principle. It was a classic British political sidestep. And don't ever forget this, especially for prelims. No matter how many new non-official members they added, the math was always rigged. The British made sure that their official members, plus the Executive Council, would always have the majority. So when it came down to a vote, the government could never lose. Period. Now this slide is absolutely vital. This is the good news, bad news part of the Act. The good news, for the very first time, Indian members could actually discuss the annual budget. This was a huge deal. They could also ask questions to the executive. But here's the bad news. Look at the limits. They could discuss the budget, but they couldn't vote on it. They could ask a question, but they couldn't ask a follow-up, a supplementary question. In any real government, the power to control the money, the power of the purse, is everything. The British gave Indians a voice, but they kept the wallet locked tight. It was the appearance of power without any of the substance. Okay, let's shift gears and look at what was happening at the provincial level. Because this is where a really significant new idea was slipped in, even if the government didn't want to call it what it was. And here it is. This is probably the single biggest takeaway from the entire act, especially when we're talking about the provinces. They introduced the principle of representation through indirect election. Again, they tiptoed around the word election, but that's what it was. And this was a massive ideological shift. It was the first time the British basically admitted, okay, it's not enough to just have people we pick. We need people who actually represent certain groups. It was a huge crack in the old system. So who got to do this electing? Well, take a look. We're talking about universities, district boards, big landowners or zamindars, and chambers of commerce. This was definitely not one person, one vote. The British were very carefully choosing established, elite, and usually pretty conservative groups to send representatives. So yes, they created a new link between local bodies and the provincial councils, but they also made sure that the people being represented were from the top layer of society, not the general public. All right, we've reached the final section, assessing the impact. This is where we put it all together. So what's the final verdict on the 1892 Act? Was it a genuine step forward or just a clever delay tactic? This is the kind of critical analysis you need for your essays. Let's start with the good stuff. What were the positives? Well, for one, you can't deny that it increased Indian representation. More Indian voices were in the room. Second, it really was the first tiny step towards a representative government, thanks to that idea of indirect election. And third, and this is a really important political point, it actually boosted the credibility of the Indian National Congress. It showed that their method of petitions and pressure, what they called constitutional agitation, could actually work. It proved you could get concessions from the British without a full-blown rebellion. And that brings us to the big, final question that you really need to grapple with in your answers. Was this a genuine reform? A small but sincere step towards giving Indians more say in their own government? Or was it just a very smart, strategic move by the British to quiet down the nationalists for a while, to give them something small to chew on while delaying any real transfer of power? Honestly, there's no easy answer. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. And understanding that complexity, that tension, is what mastering this topic is all about. It also perfectly sets the stage for what comes next, the Morley-Minto reforms of 1909.